In this lesson, I want to continue working on our page layout. And this time we want to talk about arranging the elements on the page itself. Now I've got one more element that I want to add to our page. Over here in the folder we have Golden Gate Small JPEG. So let's start things out by going up to the beginning of our document, right underneath the body tag, and I'll add in that image. We'll set the source attribute. I'll skip the alt tag for now, but if I go back out and just look at the overlay on the file, we can see that it's 280 by 213 pixels. So let's set up our width and height attributes as well. We'll finish off the tag, go ahead and save it, and then let's see what that does to our layout so far. Now you can see we've got our picture dropped right up here as the first item in our document. And since we only have margin and padding settings on our div elements so far, it's pushed up into the left-hand corner. Now again, just so we can see how our elements move around, I'll remove the margin and padding settings that we set up before, and that way we can see the exact placement of each one of our elements. Now the first thing we notice about our elements is they appear in the order that they are inside of our code. We've got the image first, followed by each one of the blocks. And by default, all of our divs or our block elements appear down below the one before it. What we're going to look at next is how I can set my components to sit side by side. The primary property that we're going to be used to control this is called float. And generally, we're going to tell an image to float with a direction, either left side of the page or right side of the page. Let's make a style rule for our image. And in it, I'll use the float property and set it to right. We only have one image on the page, so that should just be a control for our Golden Gate image. Let's see what that looks like. Now you can see that the image is pushed over to the right, and all of the other blocks of text have moved up on the page to the top left corner. The interesting thing about an object that's floated is that all of the other elements on the page will move around them. We can see this if we just resize the page. I'll pull the page in much more narrow, and now we can see the image is still up at the right-hand side, but as the space available for the first paragraph has shrunk, you can see that the paragraph's gotten a little taller, and all the text is wrapped to move around the image. We can really see this well if I were to change the height on the image. Remember, we can scale our images right on the page. I'll just change the height from 213 to 513. Let's save that change. I'll refresh. And you can see that now two paragraphs are now wrapping next to the image, while the third one is floating underneath it. If we change our browser size to something ridiculously small, you can see that all the text will always wrap around that image. Now let's take a look at what happens if we were to float this image left. I'll just go down to the style rule we created before, and I'll change the value to left. We'll save that change. And as you would expect, the image is now pulled over to the left-hand side of the page, and that's pushing all of our text over to the right. It's also interesting to note that the divs are still exactly where they were for the unfloated elements. Now, if we actually wanted to move these elements over, instead of just having them float next to the object, we can float them as well. I could go up to our div tag, and I'll set everything to float left. Now we'll have all three of our divs and our image floating. I'll save that change, refresh, and now you can see that the paragraphs all are pushed over and the full width is shown next to the image. In this case, we still have our documents sitting on top of one another, and that's simply because there's not enough room for any of them to be over here on the side, so they'll wrap downwards. If we make our browser extremely large, you can see that heading 1 and heading 2 are now next to each other. And clearly there's not enough room over here for heading 3. I'll also go back to our document and just change the image back to its original size. Now when I refresh the page, you can see that heading 3 flops over completely to the left because there's nothing there to hit. Using a combination of these elements, we can basically get whatever layout we need. Let's try out a couple more things now that we see how this works. I'll go back to our divs, and instead of floating them left this time, I'll float them right. We'll save that and refresh our page. Now, interestingly enough, you can see that heading 1 is on the opposite side of heading 2, and that's because our paragraphs are now stacking from the right side towards the left. There's not enough room here for heading 3, so it appears down on the next line. If we make our browser smaller again, we can see that our left floated elements are now separated from the right ones, and our paragraphs are in the right order, because that's the way they are inside of our code. Now let's take a quick look at what happens when we have floated items and non-floated items working together. Right now I've got all of my divs floating to the right, but we have IDs for each one of our divs. And since this style is further down than the div style, I can go down to block 3, and I'll just make a quick change. Again, I'll use the float property, but this time I'll use none. That will actually remove the right float that we set up here for all the divs. Let's save our change and see how that looks. Now you can see that heading 3 has pushed its way up to the top. In a strange way, the div itself is underneath the image because it's not floated at all, whereas our floated elements are hanging up on the left and the right where they're supposed to. Our third block is wrapping around both of them. If we pull the width of the browser window out, you can see that we still have the stacking going on here, but I'll go all the way across the screen now. And there you can clearly see heading 3 is where it would normally be. Our floated image is pushed over in front of it, and we have our other two right floated elements sitting over here, pushed to the right side of the page. Now, in addition to floats, we have one other property that can control how an element will act around them. Let me just squish this back down again. And we'll go back over to our document. And this time I'm going to add the clear property. Clear indicates what the non-floated elements will do around the floated ones. Again, we can set left and right on this to clear specifically only the left floats or only the right floats. Let me try it on the left-hand side first. We'll save that change. And when I refresh, you can see that instead of pushing its way up around the element, it has cleared that left floated element and it appears right underneath it. It'll do that on the large browser and the small size. It's still floating around the right-hand elements though. Now let's see what happens when we clear right. I'll save and refresh. And now you can see that our third paragraph is pushed down below the right floated elements. Even when the browser is big, it's lined up with the bottom of the green and not the bottom of the other image. Now if you've got a page like this with left and right floats, and the column heights will be different sizes, you can clear both left and right by simply using the both property. In our case, since the rightmost elements are the lowest ones, it's going to look the same. But if we were to make our image size bigger again, you can see the difference. I'll save that and refresh the page. And now you can see it's floating down below the leftmost element. So whichever floated element is taller will push it down the most. Well, now we have a pretty good idea of how our blocks will behave with floats and clears. In the next lesson, we'll see how to directly change the position of the block itself.